Rumpelstiltskin by the Brothers Grimm. Narrated by Cheryl Bassett. There was once a poor miller who had a beautiful daughter, and one day, having to go to speak with the king, he said, in order to make himself appear of consequence, that he had a daughter who could spin straw into gold. The king was very fond of gold and thought to himself, "This is an art which would please me very well." And so he said to the miller, "If your daughter is so very clever, bring her to the castle in the morning, and I will put her to the proof." As soon as she arrived, the king led her into a chamber which was full of straw, and giving her a wheel and a reel, he said, "Now set yourself to work, and if you have not spun this straw into gold by an early hour tomorrow, you must die." With these words, he shut the room door and left the maiden alone. There she sat for a long time thinking how to save her life, for she understood nothing of the art whereby straw might be spun into gold, and her perplexity increased more and more, till at last she began to weep. All at once the door opened, and in stepped a little man who said, "Good evening, fair maiden. Why do you weep so sore?" "Ah," she replied, "I must spin this straw into gold, and I am sure I do not know how." The little man asked, "What will you give me if I spin it for you?" "My necklace," said the maiden. The dwarf took it, placed himself in front of the wheel, and whir, whir, whir 3 times round, and the bobbin was full. Then he set up another, and whir, whir, whir thrice round again, and a second bobbin was full. And so he went all night long until all the straw was spun, and the bobbins were full of gold. At sunrise the king came, very much astonished to see the gold, the sight of which gladdened him, but did not make his heart less covetous. He caused the maiden to be led into another room, still larger, full of straw, and then he bade her spin into gold during the night if she valued her life. The maiden was again quite at a loss what to do, but while she cried the door opened suddenly as before, and the dwarf appeared and asked her what she would give him in return for his assistance. "The ring off my finger," she replied. The little man took the ring and began to spin at once, and by morning all the straw was changed to glistening gold. The king was rejoiced above measure at the sight of this, but still he was not satisfied, but leading the maiden into another still larger room full of straw as the others, he said, "This you must spin during the night, but if you accomplish it, you shall be my bride. For," thought he to himself, "a richer wife thou canst not have in the world." When the maiden was left alone, the dwarf again appeared and asked for a third time, "What will you give me to do this for you?" "I have nothing left that I can give you," replied the maiden. "Then promise me your firstborn child if you become queen," said he. The miller's daughter thought, "Who can tell if that will ever happen?" And ignorant how else to help herself out of her trouble, she promised the dwarf what he desired, and he immediately set about and finished the spinning. When morning came, and the king found all he had wished for done, he celebrated his wedding, and the miller's fair daughter became queen. The gay times she had at the king's court caused her to forget that she had made a very foolish promise. About a year after the marriage, when she had ceased to think about the little dwarf, she brought a fine child into the world. And suddenly, soon after its birth, the very man appeared and demanded what she had promised. The frightened queen offered him all the riches of the kingdom if he would leave her her child, but the dwarf answered, "No. Something human is dearer to me than all the wealth of the world." The queen began to weep and groan so much that the dwarf pitied her and said, "I will leave you 3 days to consider. If you in that time discover my name, you shall keep your child." All night long the queen racked her brains for all the names she could think of, and sent a messenger through the country to collect far and wide any new names. The following morning came the dwarf, and she began with Caspar, Melchior, Balthazar, and all the odd names she knew. But at each the little man exclaimed, "That is not my name." The second day the queen inquired of all her people for uncommon and curious names, and called the dwarf Ribs of Beef, Sheepshank, Whalebone. But at each he said, "This is not my name." The third day the messenger came back and said, "I have not found a single name, but as I came to a high mountain near the edge of a forest where foxes and hares say good night to each other, I saw there a little house, and before the door a fire was burning, and round this fire a very curious little man was dancing on one leg and shouting, 'Today I stew, and then I'll bake. Tomorrow I shall the queen's child take.' Ah, how famous it is that nobody knows that my name is Rumpelstiltskin." When the queen heard this, she was very glad, for now she knew the name, and soon after came the dwarf and asked, "Now, my lady queen, what is my name?" First she said, "Are you called Conrad?" "No." "Are you called Hal?" "No." "Are you called Rumpelstiltskin?" "A witch has told you! A witch has told you!" shrieked the little man, and stamped his right foot so hard in the ground with rage that he could not draw it out again. Then he took hold of his left leg with both his hands and pulled away so hard that his right came off in the struggle, and he hopped away howling terribly. And from that day to this, the queen has heard no more of her troublesome visitor. Brothers Grimm. The brothers Grimm, die Brüder Grimm or die Gebrüder Grimm, Jacob 1785 to 1863, and Wilhelm Grimm 1786 to 1859, were German academics, philologists, cultural researchers, lexicographers, and authors who together collected and published folklore during the 19th century. They were among the best-known storytellers of folk tales and popularized stories such as Cinderella, The Frog Prince, The Goose Girl, Hansel and Gretel, Rapunzel, Rumpelstiltskin, Sleeping Beauty, and Snow White. Their first collection of folk tales, Children's and Household Tales, was published in 1812. The brothers spent their formative years in the German town of Hanau. Their father's death in 1796 impoverished the family and affected the brothers for many years after. They attended the University of Marburg, where they developed a curiosity about German folklore, which grew into a lifelong dedication to collecting German folk tales. The rise of Romanticism during the 19th century revived interest in traditional folk stories, which to the brothers represented a pure form of national literature and culture. With the goal of researching a scholarly treatise on folk tales, they established a methodology for collecting and recording folk stories that became the basis for folklore studies. Between 1812 and 1857, their first collection was revised and republished many times, growing from 86 stories to more than 200. In addition to writing and modifying folk tales, the brothers wrote collections of well-respected German and Scandinavian mythologies, and in 1838 they began writing a definitive German dictionary, Deutsches Wörterbuch, which they were unable to finish during their lifetimes. Many of the Grimm's folk tales have enjoyed enduring popularity. The tales are available in more than 100 languages and have been adapted by filmmakers including Lotte Reiniger and Walt Disney, with films such as Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs and Sleeping Beauty. During the 1930s and 40s, the tales were used as propaganda by the Third Reich. Later, in the 20th century, psychologists such as Bruno Bettelheim reaffirmed the value of the work, in spite of the cruelty and violence in original versions of some of the tales, which the Grimms eventually sanitized. Writing. From 1807 onward, the brothers added to the collection. Jacob established the framework, maintained through many iterations, from 1815 until his death. Wilhelm assumed sole responsibility for editing and rewriting the tales. He made the tales stylistically similar, added dialogue, removed pieces that might detract from a rustic tone, improved the plots, and incorporated psychological motifs. Ronald Murphy writes in The Owl, the Raven, and the Dove that the brothers, and in particular Wilhelm, also added religious and spiritual motifs to the tales. He believes that Wilhelm gleaned bits from the old Germanic faiths, Norse mythology, Roman and Greek mythology, and biblical stories that he reshaped. Over the years, Wilhelm worked extensively on the prose, expanded and added detail to the stories to the point that many grew to be twice the length of those in the earliest published editions. In the later editions, Wilhelm polished the language to make it more enticing to a bourgeois audience, eliminated sexual elements, and added Christian elements. After 1819, he began writing for children. Children were not initially considered the primary audience. Adding entirely new tales or adding new elements to existing tales, elements that were often strongly didactic. Some changes were made in light of unfavourable reviews, particularly from those who objected not all the tales were suitable for children because of scenes of violence and sexuality. He worked to modify plots for many stories. For example, Rapunzel, in the first edition of Kinder- und Hausmärchen, clearly shows a sexual relationship between the prince and the girl in the tower, which he edited out in subsequent editions. Tarter writes that morals were added. In the second edition, A King's Regret was added to the scene in which his wife is to be burned at the stake, and often the characters in the tale were amended to appear more German. Every fairy, Vieh, prince, Prinz, and princess, Prinzessin, all words of French origin, was transformed into a more Teutonic-sounding enchantress, Zauberin, or wise woman, Weise Frau, King's son, Königssohn, King's daughter, Königstochter, Little Red Cap, the Golden Goose, Bearskin, Cinderella, Faithful John, The Water of Life, Thumbling, Briar Rose, The Six Swans, Rapunzel, Mother Holle, The Frog Prince, The Travels of Tom Thumb, Snow White and Red Rose, The Three Little Men in the Wood, Rumpelstiltskin, Little One Eye, Two Eyes, and Three Eyes. Grimm's Fairy Stories by Jacob Grimm and Wilhelm Grimm. Illustrated by John B. Gruella and R. Emmett Owen, 1922. Contents: The Goose Girl, The Little Brother and Sister, Hansel and Gretel, Oh, If I Could But Shiver, Dummling and the Three Feathers, Little Snow White, Catherine and Frederick, The Valiant Little Tailor,